So next, and to sort of close the panel before we open it up to questions, we have Erwin Freed, who's a Socialist Resurgence Staff Writer and Organizer. So Erwin, you have the responsibility of tying everything together, so good luck. So thanks, everybody.
So thanks, Reed. Thanks, Farouk, Bill, Kathy, Regina, everybody that's attending today. Really appreciate everybody on who's watching on Facebook Live. It's really wonderful to be here with you all and have this discussion about what it means that the U.S. Was defeated and the U.S. military had to at least withdraw its overt operations in Afghanistan, and what that means for working people around the world. The rapid evacuation of coalition troops and tens of thousands of their Afghan collaborators shows that the United States is no longer able to rule the entire world through economic and military force alone. This defeat comes in a context of massive struggles by working people all over the world. Regionally, some of the largest mobilizations in history have taken place in recent years. Multiple strikes of tens of millions of workers and farmers in India against the reactionary Modi regime, massive student mobilizations and peasant assemblies in Pakistan, uprisings for self-determination and against Chinese imperialism in Balochistan, a 3-year ongoing strike wave in Iran, which has recently brought in workers in the oil fields, which was the key sector in the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s and 80s, demonstrations of hundreds against U.S. occupation in Iraq, historic mobilizations in Lebanon that brought down the former government. These are all just a few of the major struggles we can look to help understand the world situation leading to the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan. Even working and oppressed people in the hearts of world imperialism are rising up. The mass movement calling for Black liberation that exploded in 2020 showed that the ruling class is losing its grip of control, not just everywhere, but also in the so-called homelands. We can celebrate the damage that the failure to successfully occupy Afghanistan has laid to U.S. imperialism. Since its inception, capitalism in the United States has used the occupation, domination, and theft of land, resources, and labor to reach the vanishingly small ruling class. Over the last 30 years, the Yankee capitalists have taken it on themselves to project power and military control in the world. These considerations were the basic justification for invading Afghanistan and Iraq. Actually, the plan was to directly occupy not only Afghanistan and Iraq, but also the whole so-called axis of evil, including North Korea, Libya, Iran, and Syria. The failure of imperialism in Afghanistan is by extension also an opening for struggle in all of these countries by workers and farmers against their own ruling classes, without having to deal also with the devastation of U.S. occupation. It shows that despite endless imperialist propaganda and even the sentiments of some people on the left, U.S. imperialism is not invincible. The Taliban becoming the ruling group in Afghanistan also shows that to really achieve national liberation and self-determination, it is going to take more than just military struggle against occupation. The rise of the Taliban as the head of the new government is a roadblock to real liberation for working people, farmers, and oppressed populations in Afghanistan. Before I talk about the Taliban, which I really appreciate all of the contributions from my fellow panelists about, I want to give some background on what the U.S. has done in Afghanistan and its neighbors. Basically, U.S. imperialism followed in the footsteps of longstanding European colonialist policy by allying with the reactionary and violent religious extremists against relatively progressive and secular parties. In Afghanistan, this famously meant working with the Pakistani government to fund and arm the most aggressive Mujahideen groups before, during, and after the Soviet occupation in the 70s and 80s. It was from these forces that the leaders of both the Taliban and the Afghanistan Republic would emerge. I think it's also worth noting that this was in the late 70s. This was also just shortly after the brutal war in what was East Pakistan and now Bangladesh, which Bangladeshis consider a genocidal war, which was carried out by what became the Pakistan government. The government that the United States set up, the Afghanistan Republic, was composed of thugs and warlords that the U.S. ruling class saw as most likely to comply with their decisions about what Afghanistan should do. It was incredibly unpopular and seen as part of the campaign of constant bombings, aerial assaults, and harassments being carried out by foreign occupiers. Parsing out the political differences between the Afghanistan Republic and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Taliban's government, with regards to women's rights, multiculturalism, and democratic freedoms is not so simple. Equally importantly to the character of the so-called central authority was the fact that internal divisions within the country, whether based on geography, community affiliation, religion, similar things, were made more intense by competing foreign interests, funding, and allying with different actors across the country, often on temporary and shifting basis. The state of turmoil in the region that is so often portrayed in the media from the U.S. ruling class is a product of the situation created by that same class, which I think Kathy has spoken to pretty effectively. As my fellow panelists have ably spoken to, the U.S.-led occupation of Afghanistan was fundamentally characterized by its brutality, inhumanity, and utter levels of destruction. Even the investment into the country by imperialist and regional powers has been used to increase their own political foothold in Afghanistan and the region. The war in Afghanistan was a war on the people for the benefit of competing global and regional powers, most especially between and from the United States, India, Iran, Pakistan, Russia, China, and the Gulf states. After well over 200,000 people have died as a result of the U.S. and NATO-led occupation, the situation is now one of imperialist vultures circling to be the ones to claim the spoils of war, with the Taliban now positioned to gain as the middlemen between the different external forces. The Taliban maintained itself in this situation as fighters against the U.S.-backed republic, if not always the occupation itself. In general, they understood themselves to be unable to militarily defeat the U.S. and did not provide a meaningful political alternative to the Karzai-Ghani regime. They were able to use sentiment against the occupation to recruit, but like the U.S. military itself, a major source of enlistment came more from economic necessity and, as Farouk described, coercion than ideological motivation. We must understand this to see that while the Taliban as a group is fundamentally reactionary, the young men who join it some of the young men who join it will be able to be won over to a real social program for national liberation and socialism. Part of the task for revolutionaries in the coming period will be to develop an organization capable of winning the best elements of the working, farming, and young populations in Afghanistan to such a program. That is the key to ending Taliban rule. Ultimately, the Taliban leadership has been backed for the whole period of its existence by the Pakistani government, and more recently by Russia and Iran. These figures have been able to secure a place for themselves as the local mediators for the imperialist plunder of Afghanistan. It is worth keeping in mind that even the leadership of the Taliban is not unified. They have had constant internal squabbles over who should be the head of the group, and each has their own relationship with different international capitals. Echoing their first government between 1996 to the U.S. invasion in 2001, the Taliban has begun to roll back women's rights and crack down on potential forces of opposition. An important part of U.S. imperial decline is the growing separation between the ruling class's desire and the willingness of working people to carry out expansive military operations. In the first place, there is a really general sentiment against war among the U.S. population. This has meant an ongoing and severe crisis in the U.S. military. Despite the $1 trillion annual budget, recruitment has remained at low levels during the entire period of occupation in Afghanistan and Iraq. Recruitment levels are so low that the ruling class and their generals have had to resort to all sorts of different schemes to maintain their military reinforcement of economic and political control in the semi-colonial world. This has included massive deployments of National Guards members, the largest since the war in Korea, redeploying and extending deployments of troops on the ground past operational protocols, which really just destroys people mentally and physically, and famously filling in the gaps with private mercenaries paid incredible sums of money to kill, maim, and terrorize all over the globe. Another component of this is well-known drone programs, which were greatly expanded under the Obama administration. All these measures receive bipartisan support from the two major capitalist parties, who both attempt to expose the other as not being militaristic enough. A good example is the Democrats' multiple attempts to reinstate the draft during Bush's presidency, claiming that the Republican administration did not have what it takes to really win the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Veterans of these occupations are an essential group that can and will be won over the revolutionary struggle in the United States. Many joined as young workers, looking for a chance to have a future and to do some good in the world. It is well known that the military disproportionately recruits Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. No one knows the great lies of imperialism better than the people who have been on the front lines in its struggle to control by force entire countries. Millions of young people genuinely believe that they will help spread democracy and human rights, only to realize that the only thing that the United States is interested in is keeping the world safe for investments. A not insignificant number of rank-and-file troops quickly realize that they have more in common with the young people they interact with every day than they do the capitalists and politicians who sent them to war. That crushing realization manifests in statistics tracking suicide, drug addiction, and other measures of social alienation among veterans. It also manifests in an increasing number of veterans joining socialist groups and becoming active in movements for social justice and against their country's wars. So what does this mean? The possibilities for Afghan liberation today. In the first place, the end of occupation can provide real relief for the Afghan masses. The end of U.S.-backed bombings is a major victory for Afghanistan and the whole world working class. And it remains, as was shown right after the U.S. started to pull out of Afghanistan and justified a drone attack by saying it was going after ISIS, it remains to be that we in the United States need to continue to mobilize to make sure that there's a real end to bombings and other military actions in Afghanistan and everywhere. Already, the modest but important demonstrations of women against draconian measures being taken by the Taliban are shown that there is an energy for mobilization to be unleashed. The question is connecting the struggle in Afghanistan with that of the regional working, farming, and oppressed masses. In order to connect the struggles, it is necessary to deepen our efforts in building a party of revolution who can combine experiences, methods, analysis, and resources to connect anti-imperialist upsurge to the program of social revolution. As the dust settles from the 20-year occupation by the United States and NATO and the reactionary push against the Arab Spring uprisings, it is clear that the conditions that led to the upsurges remain and, if anything, are more generalized. Imperialism is weaker and more fragmented than even 10 years ago. Millions of people now have gone through concrete struggles and mobilizations against imperialism and for better working and living conditions. The climate crisis is becoming more real every day. Capitalism cannot solve any of these problems. I'm happy to be on a panel with my comrade Farouk, who is devoted to really building the struggle for self-determination against fundamentalism and against capitalism that will ultimately be decisive for working people to really win the class war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and everywhere else. In the United States, we have the unending duty to resolutely oppose all military adventures carried out by our government. The ruling class in this country will take any opportunity to continue overt and covert aggression in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and wherever it deems strategically necessary. Socialist Resurgence is fundamentally for abolishing the U.S. military apparatus, including its domestic operations, and using its $1 trillion-plus budget to give first of all give reparations to its victims, and secondly fund massive programs for immediate conversion to 100% renewables, quality housing, and education for all, and ending the for-profit death spiral in healthcare. We also call for open borders and ending the deportation machine to accept all displaced working people with full economic and political rights for good. In our view, what is desperately needed in the United States is the same as in Afghanistan and everywhere else. A fighting party of working people, farmers, and oppressed groups with a program capable of leading the movements to overthrow capitalism and imperialism for all time. Socialist Resurgence and our partners in the Revolutionary Socialist Network are part of building such an organization like this every day. And we hope that you will join us in our struggle. Thanks.